Our next speaker has focused his graduate work and his career on Indigenous communities and has held a number of positions, including at Columbia University, the Justice Institute of British Columbia, and the City of Toronto. He's currently the Executive Director at Native Child and Family Services of Toronto, and he'll tell us about the challenges, opportunities, and innovations in digital education in Indigenous communities. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Schiffer to the screen. And this is a live session, so you'll have the opportunity to put some questions in the chat. And if we have time at the end, we'll try to address them. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Jay. I'm just going to take a moment here to try to share my screen. Great. Can you all see that okay? Perfect. Okay. So as Jay said, my name is Jeff Schiffer. I'm the Executive Director at Native Child and Family Services here in the City of Toronto. I have settler and Indigenous ancestry, and I'm joining you from what is the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, currently the treaty territory of the Mississauga of the Credit here in what is today Toronto, Canada. So I want to talk a little bit about digital education in Indigenous communities and some of the challenges and opportunities and innovations that we have ahead of us. And I want to start really with providing a little bit of background and context. And, you know, I have a number of lectures that I do on this, and generally I'll speak for an hour about it. And I'm just really going to try to condense a lot of this as much as possible. I know that I don't have a lot of time. The important thing really is for us to recognize when we're talking about education and we're talking about the possibility of transforming education, particularly within the context of this pandemic, it's really important for us to recognize a lot of the Indigenous complexity that existed pre-colonization everywhere across the world. And even if I just look at two examples, you know, I did some of my graduate work with the Maya people down in Guatemala. You know, at its height, the Mayan Metropolitan Center was composed of over 60,000 structures spanning the area of contemporary New York City. You know, and these cities were built with complex engineering and mathematics that were disseminated through very complex systems of education. Even if we're to turn to some of the Indigenous cultures that existed in what is today the southwestern United States, we know that these very large and complex Pueblo towns were built, these multi-story complexes, almost like modern day apartment buildings, which were surrounded by vast agricultural fields supporting very large and healthy and prosperous populations. And these are just two examples that, you know, that come from North and Central America, but we see this in South America, we see this in Australia, we see it in many, many places around the world. Very complex Indigenous societies that had complex systems of education that informed the development of healthy societies. And it's important for us to recognize that. It's especially important for us to recognize it today because there has been this erasure of Indigenous sophistication and complexity, right? That happened through colonization. It happened through missionization, where you know, there was a concerted effort to move people from Indigenous spirituality over to Christianity, and in that, for them to jettison a lot of their traditional knowledge systems. It happened through structured institutional processes that are in fact connected to education, whether it's residential schooling in Canada and elsewhere, or boarding schools that really attempted to change the way Indigenous practices around education learned. And we see it in the curriculum today, right? The curriculum of settler or non-Indigenous education systems often doesn't include a lot of that content. And it's a missed opportunity. It removes tools from our toolbox that really are important for us to have everything we need to continue to push innovation in this space for everyone's well-being, not just for Indigenous well-being. And I'll get to that in a minute. So Indigenous people today, quick snapshot, right? We have Indigenous people on every continent except for Antarctica. People forget about that. They think, oh, are there Indigenous people in Europe? And we forget about the Sami. We forget about all of the circumpolar North Indigenous people. We forget a lot about many of the other people across the world that are Indigenous, right? And these populations are currently rebounding. They're rebounding after centuries of colonization, and they're rapidly urbanizing. We're seeing this trend globally. In Canada, where I'm joining you from, Indigenous people represent the youngest, fastest growing, and most diverse demographic in our country, with the majority of Indigenous people now living in urban centers of 30,000 or more. Right. And despite the intergenerational challenges that continue to frame our understanding of Indigenous people, right, we often focus on the challenges of contemporary economic standing and the social determinants of health that continue to characterize Indigenous people because of those centuries of colonization. It's important for us to also recognize that these knowledge systems continue to exist. The same Indigenous knowledge systems that for thousands of years supported the development of healthy and complex and sophisticated Indigenous cultures and society. And I believe that as we move not only through the challenge of COVID-19, but through the impending climate crisis and many of the other struggles that we face as a human family globally here on this planet, these knowledge systems really hold vital information for solving some of these really complex problems that we face together today. This has been recognized in many different documents at national levels, right? In Canada, we had our Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. We had our national process of truth and reconciliation. Other countries have had their own national processes, but it's also now been recognized internationally, right? Through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I just want to draw all of our attention to Article 14 of UNDRIP, which really does specifically reference education, right? And it says Indigenous people have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own language and in a manner that's appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. It further states that Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels and forms of educations of the state without discrimination. And it states that in conjunction with Indigenous people, each state should take effective measures in order to, support those who are living outside of their community to have access when possible to education in their own culture and language. UNDRIP focuses a lot on the work that states have to do to reconcile with Indigenous communities, to support Indigenous people to have access to education in ways that are congruent with their culture. It doesn't go quite so far as to recognize the capacity of Indigenous knowledge systems and pedagogical practices to actually support other people, right? We've known for quite some time, and there's a lot of literature supporting the fact that Indigenous tools and approaches aren't just good for Indigenous people, they actually are good for everyone, right? You don't have to be Western to go to a Western dentist and benefit from a filling. I just got a root canal not too long ago. And similarly, you don't have to be Indigenous to benefit from some of the holistic understanding that Indigenous people have about the importance of focusing education systems on mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being and learning. So then, digital education in Indigenous communities, what does all of this mean? What are the challenges and opportunities and innovations? I mean, I think it's really important for us to understand that schooling is one of the sectors that's seen the least amount of transformative change since it emerged. And it really did emerge within this context of the Industrial Revolution, really focused on giving people concrete skills for specific things, right? For developing a specific skill set to become employed, to become a citizen, to support economy. These things are all important, but they're not the end all and be all of humanity, right? Mental health, emotional skills, a variety of other life skills that we need as human beings have not been the focus traditionally of these systems, right? And when it comes to Indigenous people, current focus on education as it relates to Indigenous folk has really focused on delivering current models of schooling within the limitations of the marginalized human geographies that Indigenous communities now find themselves in. And that's important too. I don't want to jettison that. I just want to bring our attention to the fact that those aren't the only concerns. We talk a lot about how challenging it is to deliver education to Indigenous people in rural locations, right? With limited infrastructure and connectivity. And that really characterizes Indigenous people in most places. Even in a so-called developed country like Canada, most of our northern Indigenous people don't have potable drinking water, have poor housing, and don't have the connectivity that they would need to support digital education, right? We focus a lot on the challenges of human capital, not enough teachers in these Indigenous spaces, and a lot on the social challenges that stem from colonization, which continue to impede the delivery of these educational systems, whether it's the trauma or poverty that these communities continue to experience. And yes, we need to address all of those things. But we also, quite frankly, need a bit of a reframe to not forget the fact that Indigenous knowledge systems and practices and pedagogy can actually provide a really important insight when it comes to a lot of the innovation that needs to happen regionally, nationally, and internationally when we talk about the transformations in education that are ahead of us. You know, I did my PhD at Teachers College at Columbia University, and I was talking to a professor that I used to study with back then, and he reminded me of a concept that I hadn't really considered since my days of reading thick volumes during the research for my PhD, and that's this concept of punctuated equilibrium, right? This pandemic has exposed vast inequities in our regional, national, and global systems, right? We have seen this through the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has had on Indigenous people and people of color, right? These structures and systems and processes of inequity were always there. They were just kind of beneath the surface, and we were, quite frankly, focused on other things, right? And it's hard to change systems that are ingrained in human societies over generations and generations. And the concept of punctuated equilibrium really tells us that complex human systems, they require massive shocks to be able to experience large change, right? And we can see this historically when there's massive global. We saw this after the Second World War. The world had a massive shock after World War II, and we came together and we created the United Nations, and governments changed, borders and countries changed, right? And this may be one of the biggest shocks we've experienced since that time, where we are seeing all of our systems overturned. And the silver lining for me in that is that with this massive shock in our system comes massive opportunity for change, right? We currently have an unprecedented opportunity to reimagine education in regional, national, and international spaces. And this, of course, is true for many other sectors, but we're here today to talk about education. So let's do that, right? I have always appreciated the quote, "Never let schooling get in the way of your education." And we've heard from previous presenters today the way that education happens in many different places. We heard previously about how do we connect those threads between home and school and being outside. And I think that this is one of the things that we really can learn from Indigenous systems of education, right? Which were never deployed in institutions of schools like we see today. Schooling is a very different process than education. And the digital transformation takes schooling and education out of the school yard and out of the classroom and into a variety of different places. We know that we need to strengthen public education systems to promote reconciliation and equity, to address the systemic racism that we've had calls against internationally over recent months. And I think a lot of that work can really be strengthened and propelled forward by acknowledging that Indigenous practices and knowledge systems hold valuable information to contribute to solving complex problems like climate change, resource management, sustainable cities, mental health, right? I don't have a lot of time, but we did some pilots at Native Child over the first wave of COVID, where we knew that people were not getting the mental health support that they needed. And we knew that the classroom space was not providing that to kids. And so we started providing supportive programming outside in parks, right? For Indigenous people, experiential learning is really, really important. And learning in outdoor spaces is really important. And there's no reason why digital education can't happen outside with iPads in the woods or in the forest or wherever else, right? What we also know is there's a huge canon of literature over recent decades that shows that if you are human, being outside is good for you. It's good for your mental health, and it supports learning in a lot of really evidence-based ways, right? So what does digital education look like if we reduce teacher-student ratios and change the environments in which it happens, and support families and teachers and community-based organizations to support processes of learning that involve leaning into land for wellness, particularly in ways that support learning for students that face a lot of challenges, maybe related to mental health, intergenerational trauma, kids that may be neurodivergent, a lot of that stuff, right? So enabling future innovations in the development of delivering digital education through the inclusion of Indigenous pedagogy can not only benefit Indigenous folk, but I think it's really critical to supporting a lot of other transformations that need to happen. And when I say Indigenous, I don't just mean, like the UN definition of Indigenous also includes peoples from the African continent, peoples across Asia. So we are talking about a broad group of people here. In the few minutes that I have left, I want to talk a little bit about, I just want to make some concluding comments in the few minutes that I have left. I think that it is so important for us internationally to acknowledge a global history which has been systematically erased over generations. It is so important for us to understand that the knowledge systems of Indigenous people, along with what we may call contemporary or Western evidence-based knowledge systems, bringing those together gives us so many tools to innovate in ways that support the learning and development of humans, regardless of where these humans come from or who they are. There are so many concrete practices around teaching and pedagogy from Indigenous cultures and societies that still exist today and that are so ready to be integrated into the innovations that we have ahead of us. So I think it's important for us to think whether we are teachers in the classroom, whether we are administrators, whether we are academics or community-based organizations like myself that work with schools to share and develop programming. It's important for us to think about how we apply these practices and knowledge systems as we continue to develop and innovate digital education in regional, national, and international spaces. With that, I will just say thank you very much for the time this morning. I've got information available here in case any of you would like to contact me with follow-up questions. Miigwech, thank you very much.
Jeff, thank you so much for that. That was inspiring, and it was eye-opening, and your discussion about the Indigenous knowledge shows, or at least it demonstrates to me, that a lot of the answers are literally in our backyard. Like they're actually literally and figuratively in our backyard with being outside. We do have time for some questions, and so let me go right to that. The first, it's kind of open-ended, but maybe you could comment on mental health issues in Indigenous communities.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, certainly even prior to COVID, there have been mental health challenges that have resulted from practices of colonization. They look different in different places. There's certainly a lot of similarity between Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, but Africa, Asia, elsewhere. And one of the things that, and so we've seen those really exacerbated throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and the work that we do at Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. And one of the things that we have done to combat that really is to turn to land-based trauma-informed practice. Earlier in the first wave, we partnered with Sick Kids Hospital, or the Hospital for Sick Children here in Toronto, and the University of Toronto through the Faculty of Social Work group there to begin a pilot program of providing service to families outside. And there's a canon of literature, as I sort of referenced just briefly in my presentation, that shows that a lot of the challenges that children and families are facing, which we are undoubtedly going to see play out in schooling and education systems, a lot of this can be mediated simply by being outdoors, right? There's this connection between being outdoors and moderating mental health. And so I do think it's important for us to focus on land-based practice and outdoor schooling to mitigate some of these challenges moving forward.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question. Will Indigenous communities' cultures be preserved if an online setup continues? Kind of
so I didn't want to get into this because it's a massive conversation, and so many Indigenous cultures have a lot of cultural protocols about what can be shared online and what can't. And in the Canadian context, a lot of Indigenous ceremony cannot be on video and cannot be broadcast, right? So there's a lot of basic principles about Indigenous culture and language and that, and all of that can be taught online and in digital spaces. But we in fact had a panel with elders across Canada just a couple of weeks ago to ask them how they've been managing with COVID and how community members can access cultural supports in the context of COVID when so much of it can't be shared online. And so this is a space where we're going to see a lot of innovation. I always say Indigenous people have always been innovators, right? They have not been static. This perception of Indigenous people as static and unchanging and running around in the woods, it could not be more inaccurate. And so this is a space where we're going to see a lot of innovation. Indigenous people pivoting, as everyone else has, in the context of this pandemic, to continue to share culture and their supports through digital education and other ways online.
Fantastic. Thank you.